The Texas Revolution exploded from a dispute over a buried cannon into a full-scale rebellion. At Gonzales, 18 settlers defied 100 Mexican soldiers and won, proving that determined frontiersmen could stand against professional troops. As the Army of the People marched towards San Antonio, they proved it again at Mission Concepcion, where James Bowie's tactical genius and devastating rifle fire sent Mexican forces retreating, winning the grass fight and slowly starving out General Cós's garrison. But now, in the bitter cold of early December 1835, the siege of San Antonio was collapsing, and only one man's courage would prevent the revolution from dying in the frost. December 4th, 1835. The Army of the People was dying, not from Mexican bullets, but from cold, hunger, and despair. Men huddled around inadequate campfires, their breath steaming in the freezing air. Rumors swirled through the camp. They were retreating to Goliad. The siege was over. They had failed. Into this atmosphere of defeat stepped Benjamin Rush Milam. Picture him, 57 years old, weathered by years on the frontier, his face lined from months in Mexican prisons where he'd been held for his political beliefs. He was an impresario like Austin, a man who had brought settlers to Texas and watched his dreams crumble under Santa Anna's tyranny. He had escaped from prison, ridden hundreds of miles to join the fight, and he was not about to watch the revolution collapse without a fight. Milam strode into the center of the camp. Some accounts say he drew a line in the dirt with his boot. Others say he simply raised his voice above the murmuring crowd. The words he spoke, however, are etched in history. "Who will go with old Ben Milam into San Antonio?" For a moment, there was silence. Then a cheer erupted. Men who had been ready to quit suddenly found their courage again. 300 volunteers stepped forward, grabbing their rifles, checking their ammunition. They would attack at dawn. The message was clear. If the officers wanted to retreat, they could retreat without these men. The volunteers would storm Béxar, with or without official approval. Commander Burleson, seeing the groundswell of determination, gave his blessing. The assault would proceed. The attack plan was simple but risky. The Texian force would split into two columns, one commanded by Milam, the other by Francis W. Johnson. They would enter the town from the north, moving house by house toward the fortified plazas at the city's heart. But first, they needed a distraction. Colonel James C. Neal, who commanded the Texian artillery, would feint an attack on the Alamo mission east of town. The Alamo was where General Cós had concentrated much of his artillery and many of his troops. If Neal could draw their attention and their fire, the assault columns might slip into the town's northern edge undetected. It was a desperate gamble. San Antonio's streets were barricaded. Mexican soldiers held fortified positions in the stone and adobe houses. Artillery pieces commanded the main plazas. This wouldn't be a battle in open fields. It would be brutal, close-quarters urban combat, the most dangerous kind of fighting. But the Texians had one advantage: determination born of desperation. The night of December 4th was bitterly cold. The assault columns formed up in the darkness, men checking their rifles one last time, whispering final prayers. Some wrote hasty letters home, knowing they might not survive the coming day. The smell of gun oil and nervous sweat hung in the frigid air. At 3 a.m., as most of San Antonio slept, Neal's artillery opened fire on the Alamo. The boom of cannons shattered the night's silence. Mexican soldiers tumbled from their beds, grabbing weapons, rushing to defensive positions. The cannons at the Alamo returned fire, their muzzle flashes lighting up the pre-dawn darkness. While the artillery duel raged at the Alamo, Milam and Johnson led their columns into the northern edge of town. They moved through vegetable gardens and empty lots, using the darkness as cover. Dogs barked. A few sentries spotted them and fired warning shots, but too late. The Texians were already among the houses. The battle for San Antonio had begun. The fighting that erupted over the next 5 days was unlike anything these frontier volunteers had experienced. This wasn't a battle in the open, where superior rifles gave them an advantage. This was house-to-house combat in a maze of adobe buildings, where Mexican soldiers could be hiding around any corner, behind any door. The Texians quickly discovered that advancing through the streets was suicidal. Mexican barricades blocked the main thoroughfares. Artillery pieces commanded the intersections. Snipers fired from rooftops and upper windows. Every time the Texians tried to move between buildings, they were cut down. So they adapted. They developed a tactic that would become their signature during the siege: mouse-holing. Using crowbars, axes, and battering rams, the Texians broke through the shared walls of the adobe houses. Adobe was thick but brittle. With enough force, they could smash through from one building to the next without ever exposing themselves to enemy fire in the streets. Picture the scene: men swinging sledgehammers against walls, adobe dust filling the air, making it hard to breathe. The crash of breaking walls mixed with the crack of rifle fire and the boom of cannons. Women and children who lived in these houses cowered in corners, terrified, as soldiers from both sides fought through their homes. The Texians would secure a house, post guards at the windows, then immediately start breaking through to the next building. Meanwhile, other men dug trenches in the courtyards and gardens, connecting the captured houses into a secure network. They were creating a fortress as they advanced, one house at a time. The first 2 days saw the Texians capture the Veramendi House and the Garza House, 2 substantial buildings north of the main plaza. These became their forward bases, positions they could defend while planning their next advance. The weather was miserable, cold, with occasional drizzle that turned the dirt streets into mud and made the adobe walls even harder to break through. The Texians had no winter gear, just the clothes they'd been wearing for weeks. At night, they huddled around small fires built inside the captured houses, trying to warm themselves while keeping watch for Mexican counterattacks. General Cós, watching from his headquarters, must have been alarmed. The rebels had penetrated into the town itself. His artillery couldn't dislodge them because they were inside the buildings, protected by thick adobe walls. His infantry counterattacks were thrown back with heavy casualties by the deadly accurate rifle fire. But Cós had one advantage the Texians lacked: the tower of San Fernando Church. Rising above the adobe houses and plazas, the San Fernando Church Tower provided a commanding view of the entire city. Mexican snipers positioned there could see into the courtyards, could track Texian movements, could pick off anyone who exposed themselves. It became a deadly game. The Texians learned to move only at night or to stay low, crawling through gardens and using covered routes. But mistakes were fatal. A man standing to look over a wall, a soldier crossing an open courtyard in daylight, the crack of a rifle from the church tower, and another Texian fell. On December 7th, the 3rd day of fighting, this threat became tragically personal. Ben Milam had become the heart of the assault. While Francis Johnson commanded one column, it was Milam who seemed to be everywhere, encouraging tired men, planning the next advance, personally leading attacks on key buildings. His courage was infectious. Men who were ready to quit found themselves inspired by the old impresario's determination. On the morning of December 7th, Milam was moving through the courtyard of the Veramendi House, surveying the next phase of the advance. It was daylight, risky, but sometimes unavoidable. He was studying the buildings ahead, planning which wall to break through next. High above in the San Fernando church tower, a Mexican sniper saw movement in the courtyard. He adjusted his aim, squeezed the trigger. The rifle shot echoed across the city, blending with the dozens of other shots that marked the constant combat. But this shot was different. Ben Milam dropped instantly, a bullet through his head. He was dead before he hit the ground. The news spread through the Texian ranks like wildfire. Men wept openly. Their leader, the man who had rallied them when they were ready to quit, was gone. Some wanted to abandon the assault, to retreat, to honor Milam by ending the slaughter. But Francis Johnson stood firm. Ben Milam died to take this city, he told the men. We honor him by finishing what he started. The assault continued, now with a new motivation: revenge. The fourth day saw some of the most intense fighting of the siege. The Texians, driven by fury over Milam's death, attacked with renewed ferocity. They captured the Navarro House and the buildings of Zambrano Row in brutal hand-to-hand combat. This was fighting at its most primitive, men grappling with knives and rifle butts in smoke-filled rooms, the boom of muskets at point-blank range, the screams of the wounded. The mouse-holing technique meant that Mexican soldiers often didn't know the Texians were in the next room until walls suddenly exploded inward. One account describes a Texian breaking through a wall to find himself face to face with a Mexican soldier eating his lunch. Both men froze for a heartbeat, then grabbed for their weapons. The Texian was faster. The Texian advance was methodical and unstoppable. They now controlled a continuous line of buildings reaching almost to the main plaza. Mexican soldiers, trapped in houses that were being attacked from multiple directions, began to surrender rather than fight to the death in crumbling buildings. Inside the Mexican garrison, morale was collapsing. The constant artillery barrage from Neil's guns, the terrifying mouse-holing attacks that could come from any direction, the mounting casualties, all of it was breaking the defenders' will to fight. On the night of December 8th, 4 companies of Mexican cavalry, the cream of Cós's force, deserted en masse. They saddled their starving horses, the same horses they'd been harvesting grass for during the grass fight, and rode away into the darkness, abandoning their comrades. General Cós must have felt the bitter sting of betrayal. These were professional soldiers, trained cavalry, and they had simply left. He couldn't blame them entirely. The situation was hopeless. His men were exhausted, low on ammunition, and demoralized. The Texians were literally breaking down his defenses, one wall at a time. On the morning of December 9th, the 5th day of the siege, the Texians controlled the perimeter of the main plaza. They were poised to make their final assault into the heart of the city. Their cannons were positioned to rake the plaza with grapeshot. Mexican soldiers who could see the Texian positions knew what was coming: a final, bloody assault that would turn the plaza into a slaughterhouse. General Cós made the only decision he could. He raised a white flag. The shooting stopped. An eerie silence fell over San Antonio, broken only by the moans of the wounded and the crackle of fires burning in damaged buildings. After 5 days of continuous combat, the sudden absence of gunfire was almost jarring. Negotiators met to discuss terms. The Texians, flushed with victory but also exhausted and low on ammunition themselves, were generous. General Cós and his officers could keep their sidearms. The soldiers would be paroled, allowed to march back to Mexico, on the condition that they would never again take up arms against the Constitution of 1824. Cós agreed. He had no choice. On December 11th, The formal surrender was signed at the Cós house in the Villita district, south of the main plaza. General Martín Perfecto de Cós, who had arrived in San Antonio months earlier with such confidence, now signed away Mexican control of Texas. The terms were remarkably generous. Mexican soldiers could keep one cannon for defense against Indian attacks on their march back to Mexico. Officers kept their sidearms. All troops were paroled on their word of honor not to fight against the Constitution of 1824. The Mexican army began its retreat south. They were a sorry sight, exhausted, hungry, their uniforms torn and dirty, many walking because their horses had starved during the siege. They left behind their artillery, their supplies, and their wounded, who were too injured to travel. The Texians watched them go with a mixture of relief and triumph. They had done it. They had expelled the Mexican army from Texas. The revolution seemed won. In the captured buildings, men slumped to the ground, too tired to celebrate properly. They had fought for 5 days straight with little sleep, constant danger, inadequate food. Now that the adrenaline was fading, exhaustion crashed over them like a wave. Ben Milam was buried with military honors in the courtyard where he had fallen. His grave would be marked, his sacrifice remembered. But the men were too tired to properly mourn. They just wanted to go home. The victory at Béxar was complete, but it contained the seeds of future disaster. Most of the settler volunteers, the men who had farms and families, immediately returned home. They believed the war was won. Why stay in a cold, damaged city when Mexican forces had been expelled from Texas? This left the garrison at San Antonio composed largely of newly arrived volunteers from the United States, men who had come to Texas seeking adventure and glory, men with no families waiting for them, men who had nothing to go back to. Even worse, a catastrophic political breakdown was occurring in the provisional government. The governor and the general council were locked in a bitter power struggle, issuing conflicting orders, essentially paralyzing Texas's ability to organize a coherent defense. Into this chaos came a disastrous proposal, the Matamoros Expedition. Dr. James Grant and Francis W. Johnson proposed invading the Mexican port city of Matamoros. They argued it would provide revenue and link Texas with Mexican federalists who opposed Santa Anna. The fractured government couldn't agree on whether to support or oppose the plan. The result was military anarchy. Grant and Johnson stripped the garrison at San Antonio, soon to be called the Alamo, of provisions, horses, blankets, and men for their expedition. They left Colonel James C. Neal with fewer than 100 men, poor clothing, almost no medical supplies, and inadequate food in the middle of winter. Neal sent desperate letters begging for support. "We are in a torpid, defenseless condition, without clothing, without provisions, and without money." But nobody was listening. The government was paralyzed. Most Texians believed the war was over. Meanwhile, far to the south, beyond the Rio Grande, Santa Anna was assembling an army. He called it the Army of Operations, and it numbered in the thousands. He was coming north to crush the rebellion personally, to execute every pirate who had dared oppose him. And his first target was San Antonio de Béxar, the city where his brother-in-law, General Cós, had been humiliated. The Texians had won the battle, but they were about to lose the Alamo. If you're enjoying this journey through the Texas Revolution, please hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. And share this with anyone who loves Texas history. The story of the Alamo is one you won't want to miss. 13 days that would create legends and change history forever. Until next time, stay curious.